Undergirding our thoughts tonight is the idea there in the introduction, when one considers trouble surfacing among brethren at a deadly level, and that was the church discipline. Church discipline isn't easy anytime. When it results in death, you have something especially emotional or striking, amazing, maybe could have divided brethren in some ways, because often when you have a case of church discipline, some will be for an individual or against. I don't know if Ananias and Sapphira had any friends or not, but I dare say before that day was over, they began to wonder about their friendship, if they did. But that was an emotional situation. No, I think, about 39 or 40. There's one over there. There's one or two here you can get. Maybe you won't have to be completely in the dark. I wasn't sure. I didn't think there'd be more than that in here. But the second part of that first line, the apostles of the Lord are going to be incarcerated in this chapter, put in jail overnight. And if that happened at Choctaw Church of Christ, it'd get a little of our attention. And then you have the unfolding of other events. They're being released. They're appearing in court before at least the Jewish Sanhedrin. That would be a little bit upsetting or confusing or frustrating. Could be. And then they're beaten. And all of that's unfolding in this 5th chapter. And yet, in those type circumstances, the undergirding principle or thought is the Lord's church was still growing. And if you want a great lesson on church growth in the midst of difficult circumstances, that's where we're moving this evening. So I hope we can highlight all of those thoughts in some way that will be practical and helpful to you, both in understanding Acts 5 and maybe in how you relate to God and how you recognize God relating to us. All of that's involved. Down about the 3rd or 4th line, we've got the statement by Henry Ward Beecher. Troubles are often the tools by which God fashions us for better things. That's a little bit of the principle that's in here, because it just indicates how God's people, in the midst of some difficult, disturbing, frustrating circumstances, can still shine and move on in the Lord's work. That's where we're heading. We will also note down in that second paragraph, what we really see in this chapter are the words of Thomas Carlyle: the eternal stars shine out as soon as it is dark enough. Little statement, but it, in a way, identifies the same situation we're going to see in this 5th chapter. And as I say, Harold had already last week introduced the idea of Ananias and Sapphira, so I'm going to move through that part fairly quickly, except to note a thing or two that to this day fascinates me in regard to what occurred in regard to their act, first of all, in taking the funds. Come down toward the bottom of the page, and we get the first part of this effort by the devil to cause trouble. Over in Acts 4, 1 through 3, you have the account as to the apostles being, let's Peter and John, put in ward or in the jail for a brief time, brought in and tested. And so there's an external effort by the devil to stop this good movement, the church shining, the church growing. And now we've got something on the inside in regard to Ananias and Sapphira. And that's down toward the bottom of the page. The devil's effort without and within to cause trouble. And I've got a statement right there at the bottom of the page, incidentally, in regard to this keeping back a part. That's the way it's stated in regard to they had sold the property. They kept back part of it. Few statements there to indicate it's like an embezzling situation, or you withdraw covertly and appropriate to one's own use. Now that's what they had done. That's what in their mind they were going to do. Ananias and Sapphira indicated they were going to do like Barnabas had done at the end of chapter 4. Sell property, give it all. And they didn't do that. And so on the next page you will find Peter cutting to the core by just simply stating, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? And then later indicated that he had related with a lie to God. One place maybe where the Holy Spirit is referred to as God in that context, or it could be. And then after Peter made his statement, which again Harold covered last week, we have Ananias falling down dead. And it's that point I want to make one or two observations that are somewhat interesting. Down toward the bottom of the page, part C, the death sentence and its impact. He fell down and gave up the ghost, according to verse 5 of Acts 5. And the part that is interesting to me, if it really happened, like Wilma just had a little fainting spell almost here with us, and we got a little bit concerned. Now, I wouldn't want this for all to be on you, Wilma, but what if she had died? What would that do to us? How would that affect our service the rest of the day? And that's what happened in this case. Don't know exactly where it occurred. Not necessarily, and surely not in a church building. They didn't have one. But falls down dead. And the varied factors around that, if you have a death anywhere in the community, it'll probably be in our day on the news by nighttime. And we've got enough stated here to indicate this got spread around some way. Maybe not by TV, but the word got out. Now, immediately you want to know who did it. You want to know why it happened. Was it justified murder? Was it self-defense? Or other factors that may be involved? And we don't have the details on this. But the fact he just fell over dead, and some young men, it says, came in, took him out, and buried him. All that goes on in the text in about 2 or 3 verses. And who's standing in front of Ananias when he went down? Who was there? Who was talking to him? Who? Peter. Do you think someone might have charged him with murder? Did Peter do it? Did Peter cause it by his statements? You can just see brethren getting upset about that happening at their gathering, wherever it was. And yet you do not have one word anywhere in this context. And it's going to go on now for a few hours at least to get the rest of the story. You don't have one person saying anything against Peter, which is a fairly strong indication that all who heard of this recognized it as an act of God. Had to be. Otherwise, I mentioned there in the outline, you could just see someone calling Peter a murderer or a religious bigot, extremism in religion going on here, causing someone to die. What kind of Christians are these? Fanatical demigod. Peter trying to take over. I don't know what all might have been said, but that's not said. There's not one word about who caused this. Look for it. And that's interesting, and it gets more interesting as you go on down toward the bottom of that page. I do have at the bottom of the page some illustrations of when God acts. It does affect people, but there is never any real strong arguments brought against God. You have there, about 4 or 5 lines up from the bottom. You've got the case of Leviticus 10, 1 through 3. You'll recall that of being regard to Nadab and Abihu. They offered strange fire on the altar, and what happened? Fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Now, there is an indication that Moses was a little bit upset. These were Aaron's 2 boys that were burned up, and he was excited about it, as you would be if you had 2 children that went off this stage of action in that manner. But you've got that case. And then you've got the other case there in 2 Samuel 6 through 10. They were moving the ark from Gideon on over to another area. And you remember Uzzah, what did he do? He's going to reach out and touch it, but God had already laid down a rule that only the priests were to touch the altar. And what happened to Uzzah? He was about like Ananias. He dropped dead. And again, hard for David to accept what went on. But he didn't argue much. I'm mentioning all of this just to point out that when God brings about His discipline, it, number one, is usually recognized, and number two, you don't argue about it. It's sobering. You've got the next case there, Joshua 6, 17 through 19, the case of Achan. They were going into Jericho, and they had been told in the previous chapter that they were not to take certain things in the ban. That is, not confiscate it to themselves, because the preceding verse where it says that, it says that these things that you gain at Jericho belong to the Lord. But who was it now that took some things? Took a beautiful mantle, 200 shekels of silver, 1 bar of gold. Achan. And then he was brought before the Israelites. And what did they do? Stoned him to death and burned him and the family. Sobering. These are just some cases. I'm giving these to show that at different times in biblical history, God has acted, and when it was done, it always was designed with a purpose and a goal in view. This was too. We've got that indicated over on the next page, if you'll flip on over there. Really, it's going to be at the top of the next page, but we better be honest when we're dealing with money before God. They weren't, and very early in the life of the church, God made it very evident of how He felt in regard to people who would lie to him, lie to the Holy Spirit. It just doesn't pay. Now, there are some questions at the top of page 23 that are just interesting. Why did she not come with her husband when they were, incidentally, some of you will have, they were co-conspirators. In other copies, the first ones I put out, were was omitted. And so you may not have were in there, but it should have been, and then I corrected it in this last one. But why didn't she come with Ananias? Don't know. Maybe don't need to speculate. But she wasn't there. And where was she when the group, it says, that heard these things were filled with great fear? Now, where was Sapphira at that time? You'd think she'd have been somewhere in the crowd, but for some reason she wasn't. And then why was she, as the wife, not informed before the burial as the young men took her? And did she not have anything to say in regard to where her husband would be buried? No indication of that at all. These are just some interesting things in this story that show up, and I think the intertwining gold thread is the fact God had a purpose for this, and he carried it out like he wanted it. And she had nothing to say about the burial plot, how to take care of her husband's body, or anything like that after he died. She's not consulted at all. Now, later she will come on the scene, and we know what happened after that. We'll get to that in just a moment. But interesting, what didn't happen in regard to Ananias, his death, and Sapphira's part through these early stages. On down about number 6, there is a fairness and a justice in Sapphira not knowing what had happened to Ananias. It gave her an opportunity to clear her name as to the conspiracy. Peter asked what we usually wouldn't ask in regard to a gift. When things are given here at the church, have you ever had any of the elders come to you and say, why did you do this, or how much did you get? We don't do that. But Peter did. That's the reason I say God seems to be behind this thing, because the unusual is being done, or the usual is not being done. And yet she had a chance to say, well, no, we sold it for this much and we were just giving this much. That would have cleared her name. But she hadn't cleared. It's obvious she was as guilty as was Ananias. And then, very quickly, not a lot of discussion. Let's meet next Sunday and see what to do with Ananias and Sapphira. It happened on the scene. When God decides to act, he doesn't have to wait to ask what the brethren think. And in this case, she immediately fell down dead. And then they went out and buried her right beside her husband. Ruth and I have a plot down in Lubbock, Texas. It already has our name on it. And sometimes you see these plots and there are things engraved. What do you think might have been engraved on the funeral marker for Ananias and Sapphira? Well, probably they didn't even do it like that in those days. But I know when I was in Jerusalem, I was able to go over where they claimed that Lazarus was buried and resurrected, as in John 11. And they've got two places where Jesus is supposed to be buried, so they have a consciousness of a burial plot relating to certain people. And if that's true for Ananias and Sapphira, what do you think anybody walking through the cemetery would see their names or know that's where they were buried and forget how they died? What a memorial God made in this case, as these two were just buried side by side. Then it mentioned for the second time, really, once in verse 5 and again down in verse 11, great fear came upon the whole church and all who heard these things. Now, I want to touch on that one part, all that heard these things. There's every indication that this would have gotten back to the chief priests and the elders. What about Roman soldiers who would take care of legal matters in the case of death? Where are they? There's not one step taken, according to the record, that would indicate either the Roman government or the Sanhedrin, the chief priest, any of them had one thing to say about these two deaths. The only thing it would cover their thinking was great fear. Listen, this doesn't happen every day. This doesn't happen every century. And it seemed to make an impact on everybody that was involved, and they just wanted to leave their hands off of it. That's the part that is silent, but it's a significant silence in regard to when God acts. You and I don't argue. And the fact they were struck down dead over this matter certainly would then affect us in regard to how we would make use of money that we give. I sure hope you and I will be honest about it. There's many in this congregation who give in a beautiful way. And surely the Lord will bless you to do even more. But if there's anybody else, well, you can follow that through in your own application. Down at the bottom of the page, Part E, there's a statement about Acts 5:11. It's the first time in the book of Acts you have the word church actually mentioned. And I have some comments down there in regard to names of the church: Church of God, Churches of Christ, the church, and other terms. On the bottom of that page, in the top page 24, if you want to cover that. It's not really a point I want to make right now. I'm just saying there's some material on that in case you wanted to follow it up. I do have at the bottom part of the section leading down to part 2 on page 24, up the top there, God's action. In Acts 5:1-11, it's very clear that absolute honesty is essential in money matters among God's people. Well, that probably would cover that section sufficiently. Let's move on now into what occurred right after that. I'm going to read just 2 or 3 verses. Acts 5, verse 12, if you want to pick up in the text. By the hands of the apostles were many signs and wonders wrought among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's porch. 2 or 3 points here we'll emphasize in just a moment. But of the rest dared no man join himself to them. That's a little almost parenthetical expression that is significant in the midst of everybody else's in harmony. And then some, though, didn't want to get near the apostles. Who are we dealing with? have a little material on that in a moment, at least as a thought. Then verse 14. And believers were the more added to the Lord, multitudes, both of men and women. Come back to that in a moment. Insomuch that they even carried out the sick into the streets and laid them in the beds at the least. Peter's shadow might at the least overshadow some of them. Quite an impact being made. There also came together the multitude from the cities round about Jerusalem, bringing sick folk, and them that were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed every one. That's the next section, and that's covered primarily on page 24, with a few thoughts dropped in along the way. This with one accord is in part A, and if you will notice, that's an expression that's been used several times in the book of Acts. Acts 1:14 and 2:46, 4:24, and now here in 5, showing the harmony, the unity that was among the people. Now this is also after the burial of Ananias and Sapphira. Brethren were of one accord. And of course you've got the miraculous power that's being carried out. There's some part in A there, 2A, that relates to the purpose of miracles being performed in accord with Mark 16, confirming the word by the signs that followed. That's what's underway here as the church continues to have an impact in this city. But then you've got part B. We'll take just a moment on that. Says of the rest, dared no man join himself to them. Now, who would that be? I don't know what your thoughts may be, but I know the pattern that I especially connect with India. You also saw it in Nigeria, and you see it in this country. I haven't been related to a congregation, even in the United States, but what there were people who would come to the churches, and that won't just be the Church of Christ. I'm sure the other churches in this area would have similar stories to tell, wanting funds, food, and all. And I'm not dealing now for one moment with someone really in need. Thank God we've got the spirit of people here who are willing to give to someone that is in need. And that happens also, and it's very real. But you've got others that make it a pattern to just hit the churches and get money and get food. That's an element. And I always think, I guess over in Texas, I was in Louisiana preaching, and a man came by. He told me that he had been in Texas, and he also told me where he was from. And I was amazed at him, because when someone like that would come to us, didn't have elders at the church then, so I got the benevolent cases like that. And invariably, I'd ask a number of questions. And more than once I have said, "You are a liar." Because I'd ask questions in regard to, they claimed they were members of the church, and I'd ask them where they became a member and what they did and how did things unfold. This man surprised me, because he not only gave biblical answers to every question I could think of, but some places he'd tell me where it was found in Scripture. He made one statement that let me know the whole thing was a sham, and he had been lying to me all along. And when I told him he was a liar, the rest of the time he is with me, the only question he wanted to know was, "Why'd you say I lied?" He was wanting to find out where he slipped, because he was smooth. And he had told me about a place in Texas where he had been, showed me a bulletin related to a Baptist church. And I put that in my pocket. He probably didn't notice because we were talking back and forth. And then I wrote to that church, and he was a Baptist 1 day before, and over here he is a member of the church. Well, I'm just talking about individuals, and he was gifted at it. He said he'd gone to Harding. He was familiar. He'd been by the church at Broadway in Lubbock. He called out names. And I don't know where all he'd gotten help, but he let me know one or two things that I knew he wasn't a member. And then I wrote to this church in Texas, and he was a Baptist over there, they said. And he could have covered that. He could cover doctrine, different views. Well, now, bring that type person into the setting of Ananias and Sapphira. Do you think they'd want to make a pretension before the apostles? I don't think they'd want to get in a block of Peter with a false fabricated story, because that type thing doesn't go very well here with this group. They die when they make a pretension and don't tell the truth. And I'm saying that is probably the background to the one in verse 13, but of the rest dared no man to join himself to them, because everything else about the apostles is positive and good. But they did, that type element didn't want to get near them. Well, just a thought. That's in the outline along the way. It mentions now that a multitude of men and women. That is actually the first time that you have women mentioned as being in the church. Now, of course, you got the case of Sapphira that lets us know some women had already obeyed. She didn't do too well, incidentally, but down at the bottom of the page, I'm saying this for the ladies present tonight, there's a listing in Acts of women. I picked this up, of course, as I've noted, from David Roper, but he just kind of highlights down through the book of Acts a number of women that were quite prominent. Dorcas, remember, one who had filled her life full of good works. And they had the clothing and all that she had sewed, like we've got a number here that sew and put things together. There's Mary, John's mother. She's given special mention. And Rhoda, Timothy's mother, Eunice, and could have added Lois, the grandmother. Lydia, well, I can see here that bell, and I need to move on. But there's some good background there to women in the church in the book of Acts for you ladies that might want to follow up on that. Now, on this next page, 25, you've got the apostles being arrested and put in prison. Down to part 3, the detention that attracts even more attention. And it says that they knew it was for jealousy that they were doing what they were doing. Remember, it had just said multitudes of men and women were obeying. The church was shining. And the devil's efforts on the outside or the inside wasn't stopping it. And it doesn't need to stop it to this day. Continuing to do good works. But from a great campaign, and we know from over in the 4th chapter that there were at least 5,000 men now that were members. You could see the apostles wanting to be with the brethren, but now they're put in jail just for a few hours, of course, but they must have wondered, how long is this going to last? Don't know what all they thought that night, but an angel of the Lord came during the night, opened the doors, and brought them in. There's a statement there on 3b. Several places down through the book of Acts, you've got the work of angels, just like on the preceding page, we had women mentioned. Well, a number of times angels were a part of the story, and this time, this one had the key to the jail. He doesn't need a key, but anyhow, they got out of prison, and they were told to go in and teach. Go your way, stand and speak to the people in the temple the whole message of this life. And they proceed to do that, entered into the temple about daybreak and taught. And you have then the Sanhedrin gathering and ready to put these men on trial that they thought were still in jail. And then they come and check out the situation, and the guards are there, the jail is locked, and there are no prisoners. Exactly the same type pattern as it was in regard to Christ's tomb that they were going to guard, so that he wouldn't come out with a resurrection story. And then you remember the last part of Matthew, in Matthew 28, you have the account of this same thing coming when they didn't know how to handle this. The word was that the tomb was empty. Well, you go tell the people that his people stole him out of the tomb, and they told a lie and paid them to do it, said they'd take care of them so they wouldn't be in trouble with the Roman officials and all. Well, it's about the same thing here now. These people are wondering, what is this going to come to? It's interesting to me that not one time do you have the question being raised to the apostles when they do find out they're over there teaching, how did you get out? That's never asked. Maybe they didn't want to know how they got out. Too many things happening here with no human explanation, because it's a divine God at work. And he doesn't do things our way in many cases. Well, you've got that account then on through that entire page of their putting him in jail, thinking they were in jail, and then word comes that the men that you're looking for are in the temple where they told them not to go, teaching what they told them not to teach in the very place they were not supposed to be. And that is the rest of that page just about. Down at the bottom, I do have some material I'll just briefly mention in regard to an element that was and has been in the church that was opposed to Bible classes. There's not much of that now that goes on, but you've got some material there. There's 3 times by 3 different sources that it mentions here that the apostles, plural, were teaching. So there's a good argument for Bible classes if you needed them, because the Lord's people began with classes. Here were 12 of them teaching at the same time in the temple. And you've got material on that and why there would be classes down at the bottom of that page. That's the second bell. Read the rest of it. It's good material. But I don't believe I'll try to take care of the next 3 or 4 pages. Acts, the 5th chapter, quite a chapter. In the midst of trying and difficult circumstances, there continues to be the church growing. Brethren, I hope it'll help us seek to be fruitful in our day, because we've got better circumstances, better transportation, more material likely, but certainly we still have the same material they did. And if the church will, it can surely shine today, because they showed us how it could shine in harder circumstances than what we're facing. You're dismissed.